to Ask the Expert with Manufacturing Management in association today with Inspired. And here with me today is Fenella Stalbow, Head of ESG Services at Inspired, and we're here to discuss navigating the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So first of all, hello Fenella, and perhaps we could start by if you could explain what the carbon border adjustment mechanism actually is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism is called CBAM for short, and it puts a price on imported emissions intensive goods, essentially to avoid carbon leakage between countries. So when I say carbon leakage, referring to a situation where a company decides to move their production from a country with more rigorous policies to a country that's more lenient. And that causes movement of greenhouse gas emissions from one country to another, hence the term leakage. Many countries are legitimately trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but there are a few concerns that implementing stricter environmental regulations could cause loss of business to competing nations that might have more lax policies. So that could have severe impacts on both the environment and the economy, which is why mechanisms like CBAM are being introduced. It's really essentially to help ensure that the carbon price of any imported goods is equal to the carbon price of domestic production. And the hope is also that CBAM is going to encourage cleaner industrial production in other countries as well, so that they won't be taxed quite so heavily on their exports. Just as a kind of overview of what's happening at the moment with CBAM, in 2023, the EU was the first political power to actually enact it, and the UK is planning on following suit in 2027, I believe.
Okay. And how does CBAM actually work in practice?
Yeah, so the kind of general idea is that it will require on an annual basis that importers of any carbon intensive goods declare, first of all, the quantity of goods that they've imported in the previous year, and also the embedded greenhouse gas emissions of those goods. So the importers then have to purchase CBAM certificates to cover every ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that's emitted from production of their imported goods. And those certificates are surrendered annually through what they're calling a CBAM registry. It's quite a similar process to the current emissions trading schemes that are set up in the EU and the UK. In the EU, with their CBAM regs, they're currently going through a transitional phase just to ease in the regulation before there's any full CBAM rollout. And during that phase, importers are only going to have to report greenhouse gas emissions on their imports without actually having to make any sort of financial payments. During that transitional period as well, they are asking their importers to report on a quarterly basis. The permanent system actually enters into force on the 1st of Jan 2026. So that's when they'll require the annual reporting and purchase of CBAM certificates. So there will be a cost implication for those importers from that date. Generally, the cost of CBAM certificates is considered to be equal to the carbon price that would have been paid if the goods had actually been purchased under a country's internal carbon pricing rules. So, for example, for EU CBAM, the price will be based on the weekly average auction price of EU ETS allowances. So there's that like-for-like comparison between the two. If importers can prove that a carbon price has already been paid during production of their imported goods, then apparently that corresponding amount can be taken off the CBAM price. So that means that for manufacturers in countries that actually have emissions trading scheme systems in place, so like the UK with UK ETS, they're expected to hopefully have lower taxation on exports than any manufacturers in countries without that internal carbon pricing mechanism in place. So there's a benefit to the fact that the UK has its own emissions trading scheme system for CBAM.
Okay, I mean that touches on the next question really, which is how does the EU CBAM affect UK manufacturers in the short term?
Yeah.
Are there any other implications?
Yeah, absolutely. So any UK manufacturers that are exporting specific CBAM covered goods to the EU are going to have to start providing emissions data to their EU customers. And we're already seeing requests for that coming through during this transitional phase. So the main imminent impact is that reporting of emissions data. And it is important to note that the EU CBAM only applies to selected goods and what they're calling precursor materials. So that is cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen. So those are the key products and items to keep an eye out for. Any UK manufacturers that are exporting those CBAM goods to the EU will be affected by the regulation. And the reporting requirements for EU CBAM aligns with the EU ETS requirements. So actually a full carbon footprint isn't needed for products, which is useful to know. The key 3 sets of data that is required under EU CBAM is, first of all, direct stationary emissions. So that's any emissions from natural gas from heating, or propane that may be used in furnaces, for example. Those emissions will need to be collected, and they'll also need to be attributed to individual products for reporting purposes. Useful to know in this section is that mobile emission sources are not included in this. So, for example, if you're using forklifts or telehandlers, for example, on site, they don't need to be included in the reporting. But this direct stationary emissions also includes any imported heating or cooling. So, for example, if you're purchasing steam from a third party for your process, you'll need to make sure you're documenting that. The second category that they are looking for is indirect emissions from the generation of electricity that's consumed during production. And again, those emissions need to be attributed to individual products. The idea of that attribution is that you can then scale up emissions based on the total number of products that have been imported. So you can understand the total emissions footprint from imports. The third and final bit is indirect emissions embedded in relevant precursor materials. So when they say relevant precursors, it includes any CBAM covered goods that are used as input materials in the manufacturing process. So, for example, if you're using steel, which is a CBAM covered good, in your product, and your final product is then exported to the EU, we're going to need to understand emissions associated with that steel you're using. So yeah, each of the precursors have their own embedded emissions, which is essentially emissions associated with manufacture, that need to be included in your reporting. And that means that manufacturers are going to have to monitor and report quantities of those input materials, and also start engaging with suppliers to gather supplier-specific information on those products as well.
Okay, I guess that prompts the question, what can Inspired do to help with UK CBAM?
Yeah, we've got a range of services that can support with this. So, for example, we help with Scope 1 and 2 emissions calculation, which would feed into that reporting of direct stationary and indirect electricity emissions reporting under CBAM. We also can help with a calculation of Scope 3 emissions, which links into the embedded emissions within precursor materials. We have tools that can support with supplier engagement. So when you're looking to reach out to your suppliers, your own suppliers, to collect data, we can help with that, to capture that supplier specific information. And we can provide sort of ultimate reports that you would send to your EU customers with that relevant information for them. So we have a range of services and tools that could help manufacturers with this compliance piece. So please do reach out to the Inspired team for support if you have any questions or would like help with your CBAM compliance.
Okay, and with that, it really just remains for me to say thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.